Good evening and welcome to the program. This is What's Your Story right here on KTN Home. My name is Catherine Mwangi. I'm happy you've made the time to tune in tonight because an exciting, inspiring conversation awaits you. We're here at the residence of the High Commissioner of Australia to Kenya, His Excellency Luke Williams. He's a bookworm. He has an eclectic taste in music. He loves rock and heavy metal. Believe it or not, he also has a deep-seated passion for Africa. His first posting was in South Africa, and that's where he also met the love of his life, Miss Helen Williams. And he used the line that he's passionate for Africa to woo her. So you see, there's a beautiful story that awaits us. So let's go meet Balozi and get this show on the road. There you are, Your Excellency.
Catherine,
how are you?
I'm really well, and how are you?
I'm happy. I'm happy to be in Australia.
Well, welcome
Yeah.
to the residence, and this is a taste of Australia here in Nairobi.
Yes.
And it's a taste I hope will inspire you to visit Australia.
Awesome. I'm looking forward to knowing your story. So,
Please, come in.
Thank you. Sir, you're most welcome to the program.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, Catherine.
Thank you for having us here and your willingness to share your incredible story. You know, I can't wait for our audience to just get to know what I already know and maybe get surprised during this conversation. So tell me, sir, first of all, when did you come to Kenya?
I came here in November 2020 in the height of COVID-19. And to be frank, it was a refreshing surprise because we came from a pretty severe lockdown in Australia where the borders were closed and it was difficult to move around. And so when we arrived in November 2020, we found that it was actually less restrictive.
Yes.
So it was refreshing, to be honest.
Yeah. And it wasn't your first time in Kenya, though. You'd been here before.
Yes. First came here in December 2018. And I'd never been to East Africa before, been to other parts of Africa, but not East Africa. And I was just blown away by the dynamism that was in the streets here. And there was so much activity. And I remember going back and telling Helen, my wife, that, wow, that's a really exciting place and we should think about it as a future posting opportunity.
So you sent out the energy into the universe and you found yourself here 2 years later.
Exactly.
Okay. So let's track back to, where this journey started and maybe just maybe a little bit lower than that, your childhood. Australia is obviously a very, very close friend to Kenya, and Kenyans in general got introduced to Australia through a TV show that's very popular and famous, Neighbours. And so even for me personally to just have this conversation with the High Commissioner of Australia to Kenya is quite something because we all were glued to Neighbours back then. So is Australia what we think it is from watching that TV show? Is it even better, maybe?
Well, it's a very good question because I come from the same city that Neighbours was set in and filmed in, namely Melbourne, which is in the southeastern corner of Australia.
Okay.
And Neighbours was set in Ramsay Street. And it was very much about suburban life in Australia. And for me, growing up in the Melbourne suburbs, a lot of the street scenes they showed were very familiar. What most Australians experience growing up. There's some ideas that Australia is about the bush, the outback, the rural areas, but most Australians live in suburbs, in big cities.
Right.
And so Neighbours very much connected because people felt it was real life.
Yes. So you were born in Melbourne?
Yes.
Okay.
Way back in 1963.
Oh, so you are as old as Kenya's independence.
Yes.
That's pretty cool. Okay, so what was it like growing up? What are some of your favorite childhood memories?
Well, I have fond memories of my childhood.
Okay.
I was the first of 4 siblings born to my mum and dad. My dad was a primary school teacher. my mum, once children were born, became a stay-at-home mum. And this was typical of families out in the suburbs. And at the time I was born, and they'd sort of recently purchased a new home. It was an outer suburb of Melbourne. No longer is the case. It's very much more like inner Melbourne, but it was at that time on the fringes. And we were surrounded by families of similar ages. And it was what you would describe now as a sort of lower middle class upbringing, but one in which I just remember roaming the streets and having lots of fun. And so for me, I have fond memories of that time, and enjoyed it very much. And you know, you go through school, and I went to just local government schools, the schools just down the road. And as you sort of grow older, you start developing and forming your own identity. And something that we did a lot of in Australia at that time was sport. So sport dominated our lives. And so all the children of those ages you were quickly immersed in the sports that are very popular in Australia. Australian rules football in Melbourne is unique to Australia, but it dominates life in Melbourne.
So your love for Africa started, first of all, through watching this documentary. It's amazing how your life has come full circle, but we'll get there. I don't want to go ahead of myself.
But I used to love watching on television on Sunday nights a program in the early 70s called Wild Kingdom. And it was an American program. But what appealed to me were the animals that were not from Australia. And that's when I developed my love of the cheetah, because whenever they had a special program about the cheetah, I used to be riveted by that. And I still see the cheetah as my favourite animal. And so it was both people who were inspiring, but also the animals of the continent as well.
Right. Okay, high school, you know, were you a rebel? Were you a good boy?
No, I was always teacher's pet. For whatever reason, I didn't misbehave. I was someone who wanted to be seen to be good and achieving. So I was not someone who went through teenage angst. I never experienced that idea of rebelling against authority. After finishing final year of secondary education, I didn't know what I was going to do. And so I decided to go to my local university, which is Monash University in Melbourne, which a lot of Kenyans have studied at over the years. And because I loved history and literature and politics, those were the subjects I studied as an undergraduate. But I more and more gravitated towards the history side of things. And it was in my third year at Monash University that a course was offered called The Stirring of the Masses in Black Africa. And the title alone stood out for me. And up until then, I'd been very much focused on European history and American history. I wasn't interested in Australian history. I never studied that at university. And lo and behold, when I then undertook my very first posting at the end of 1991, it was to South Africa I went. And so it changed my life because I'd never been overseas before. Never been on a plane. But immediately I was thrown into a world in which I realised all of my learning about being overseas or what the world is like had been formed through books. And the reality of then living in another country, which is a fantastic opportunity, not being a tourist but living there, made me realise quickly how naive I'd been about how much I knew.
Okay.
And so it was absolutely life-defining for me going to South Africa.
How old were you?
At that time I was 27.
Oh, wow. So pretty young, eh?
Yeah.
To be going overseas, especially to Africa.
Well, someone who wasn't very worldly wise in that sense. And so it was quite confronting, actually. I mean, Australia experiences racism. Most countries do. Yeah. But I wasn't prepared for just how deep it ran and how society was so rigidly organised along those lines. So it was an eye-opener for me, a real eye-opener.
And what were your roles in Cape Town and Pretoria?
Yeah, I served we had an embassy in both.
Both, yeah.
And I had the best, what I think, what we called it a third secretary political. I was third secretary political. The best third secretary political job in all of our network, because it was a time of momentous historical change unfolding in South Africa. Yeah. And my job was to be the liaison point in the embassy with the African National Congress, the South African Communist Party, Inkatha, the Pan-African Congress, the Congress of South African Trade Unions, all the so-called opposition parties, and to have that opportunity. And I was charged also with reporting back to Canberra about all the negotiations that were taking place to effect change there and to move towards elections. It was a unique job, and I used to wonder how lucky I was being paid to do this sort of work. It's not normal for most people.
What you enjoy doing.
Yeah.
And something very special also happened to you whilst working in South Africa.
Indeed. Mm-hmm. Yes. No. So I arrived in December 91, and in May 1993, I happened to meet my now wife, Helen, who was British, and we just met. She just recently moved there, and we sat together at a restaurant, a Portuguese restaurant, ironically, in Pretoria. And I remember talking to her, and I used a line that I didn't think was important at the time, but it made a big impression on her. Okay. Because I said to her, look, I've got a passion for Africa. And I think she was impressed by that, because she was looking for people who had a passion for Africa. Okay. So, so we met there and started dating seriously about 3 months later. And then...
Wow, after 3 months, eh?
3 months.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and then in early February 1994, we went to Maputo, Mozambique, which had just opened up. They've gone through a long civil war, and it just opened up to international flights from Johannesburg. And we went there for a weekend, and I proposed to her there. And so we then were married in September 1994 in England, from where Helen comes from. Yeah. And then honeymooned in the Seychelles, Africa again. Wow. And then we moved to Cape Town and spent the first 10 months of our marriage in Cape Town. And that was wonderful as well.
Yeah. So then we should just at this rate you're Australian and African, eh? You know how, because all the milestones seem to have happened here, especially the most important one, which is, the love of your life. But we'll get to that, and I'll let the viewers know, what's coming up. But still, so you served here as the third secretary and the second secretary as well.
Yes, yes. So because we had two embassies,
yes.
And was there for approximately 3.5 years.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
In South Africa.
Yeah, and it was fascinating because also when I arrived, South Africa was isolated, sanctions were in place. But during that time, especially once the agreement had been reached to hold elections and elections happened, you had all the sporting sanctions lifted. So the very first rugby Wallabies team from Australia was able to tour. We had also cricket matches. South Africa participated in the World Cup in Australia. Our rugby team then came for the World Rugby Cup in May, June 1995, which South Africa momentously won. And so having all of that happen as well made it a unique experience
For you. Okay, and also you've served overseas, and yes, I know there's a period of time where you also served in Australia, but you've served in Portugal and Thailand.
Yes. So Thailand was the next posting for us
immediately after
South Africa.
Oh, okay.
So we moved there from 1999 to 2002 when our children were very, very young. In fact, we took a 10-week-old baby, our second born, across to Thailand. And again, neither of us had lived in Asia or really knew Asia.
Yeah.
Although Helen had lived in South Asia. But that again was, I think it was better than we were expecting. And we were able to learn a lot about culture in that part of the world. And Thais are famously welcoming and warm. And so we thoroughly enjoyed that time. We were able to travel around the region. You know, our kids were very young, so that experience of them in those years was a very happy time for us.
Yeah.
And we, you know, my job at that time, I used to look after Thailand's relations, its foreign relations, and so I did a lot of work along the borders, visiting refugee camps along the Myanmar-Burma border, visiting the south of Thailand where there's a lot of separatist activity happening because of disputes about who controls which territories there. So again, work-wise, it was a fascinating period for me, and one in which, again, we both have very fond memories of.
Yeah. And what was Portugal like?
So Portugal came a few years later. We were there from 2006 to 2009, and it was a country which we previously applied to go to because we both thought that was a very interesting European location. It was my first ambassadorial assignment, and so we had great expectations about it, and those expectations were absolutely realised. We thought Portugal was a wonderful country, a highlight of Western Europe, and the people were tremendously warm, and we felt very much at home there. Again, our children were at a certain age where they were developing and growing, and you know, there were challenges with that, relocating a family where the children are more aware of what's going on, may not necessarily want to change. So you had to go through those challenges, but it was, for us, both Helen and I, a really important part of our lives that we dearly loved, and we've been back again with the children to revisit it. And the country's changing, like all countries do, but incredibly warm memories.
You making that application to the Department of Foreign Affairs back then in your 20s.
Yes.
And having to, you know, travel to all of these places. At what point did you sit and, you know, say to yourself, yeah, that was the right decision, I'm on the right path?
Yeah, because when I originally applied, I didn't think of myself becoming what's called a career diplomat.
Yes.
It wasn't a feature of my mind. I was thinking more, I'll give this a go for a few years, see, and in all likelihood, I thought I'll return to Melbourne, because I just thought Melbourne was my home and where I would be. But going to South Africa, meeting Helen, and once you're in an international marriage, that means that you've got to think about both of you, and how you can balance the respective relationships for families that are at different sides of the globe. And it seemed obvious then actually that being in the Foreign Service would be a natural fit for us, and enable us to be able to meet those responsibilities. And also it was apparent to me that I felt comfortable in that working environment.
So I think Africa is your the melting pot of this, your professional and personal lives, I think. I don't know.
It's our common reference point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So we'll come back after the break and talk about what Australia and Kenya are doing together, or have done together also since you came here, and also your other postings, or rather your responsibilities, because you also cover Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, the UNEP and UN Habitat.
Correct.
And East Africa Commission.
Yes.
That's like 100 jobs.
Yeah, it's too many.
And you're still a husband and a dad.
Yeah.
And a friend to many. So after the break, His Excellency Luke Williams will be letting us know how he just juggles all of these balls up in the air, and maybe some drop and maybe don't, who knows. That's right after the break.
But it goes to a lot more than just that side of the creatives. We're big on promoting sport as well, and we actually supported the very first women's soccer tournament. So a number of teams came together and played in Lodwar, and again to see the excitement on the girls' faces, and to hear how much it meant to them. And a lot of these are teenage girls. They've got children. They've already, they've gone through a lot.
Welcome back from the break. It's What's Your Story right here on KTN Home. Thank you so much for tuning in tonight. You're having a conversation with the High Commissioner of Australia to Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda. He's also the permanent representative to the UN Habitat and UNEP, and also the representative of Australia to the East Africa Commission, His Excellency Luke Williams. Thank you for being with us still.
Pleasure.
So all of those responsibilities that you carry here in your heart as well, how do you do that?
It's a challenge, and to be honest, it is too much to be able to spread yourself across all of those responsibilities. So we have to prioritise, of course, and being based here in Nairobi means that Kenya is front and centre for us as a bilateral relationship. So you do spend most of your time on Kenya matters, and a lot of my job as a High Commissioner is representational and protocol. It means ensuring you know as many key Kenyans as possible. And because the UN is here as well, that also is a focus. With the other countries, one has to find time to travel and do the same in terms of making those contacts and ensuring that we know who's who. But inevitably, they don't get as much attention as Kenya does. And Kenya is, for Australia, our most important bilateral partner here in East Africa.
Why is that?
There's a lot of commonalities.
Okay.
Aside from the fact we're both former British colonies, for both Kenya and Australia, we're very much believers in a rules-based global order, and that's what we want to see maintained. And so we see eye to eye on many issues. We vote similarly on many issues, and it's as a result a bilateral relationship which has a lot of feel-good factor to it.
Right. But one of the best things I think that has happened for Kenyan youth especially is the opportunities to study in Australia. You were saying to me a while back that, Perth, a city in Australia, is like a little Kenya, So education, I feel, has been, a very valuable relationship between our two countries. What would you speak to those opportunities, those education opportunities, especially to the young people watching?
And there are a few reasons for that. I mean, one is that value for money. We arguably provide a better value product than our competitors. I won't name our competitors, other countries, but we do. But also just the Australian culture is one where every single Kenyan who I've ever spoken to who has been to Australia and studied there has highlighted the warm welcome they received and the way in which they were able to integrate very easily into the Australian way of life. And so that's a powerful means by which Australia is perceived to be a destination of choice.
Yes.
And that's what we're increasingly seeing. And unfortunately, with COVID-19, we saw the lockdown and the resultant inability of international students to come to Australia to study for a few years. Once we reopened our borders in late 2021, the reaction from international students to get back in was immediate. And from Kenya, there's been an absolute groundswell of interest. And here now in Kenya, we have what's called the Kenya-Australia Alumni Association. It's very active. Only yesterday I was in Kajiado launching a project with them, a tree planting project involving the association and the Africa, the Green Africa Foundation. And what's interesting about that association is these are all former Kenyan students at Australian universities who've come back. They're in increasingly important positions of influence and power in not just government but the private sector. And they're very much advertising to everyone that they know and meet the value of going to Australia to pursue higher education. So we're incredibly thankful.
Besides trade and development, education, I know you're also very passionate about women and creatives. Could you just speak to that? So when it comes first to women empowerment, or people in the creative, art, literature, maybe you're a nerd, eh? You're a self-proclaimed nerd.
Yes.
So how have you been able to, just see, or rather embody those passions as a diplomat here with the local community in Kenya?
One of the Australian government's priorities is empowerment of women and girls. We've actually recently appointed a new ambassador for gender equality.
Okay.
And we here in East Africa make it a priority of everything we do, and we have a active public diplomacy program, as we call it, that seeks to identify initiatives and activities that we can help support to empower women and girls, and especially in the creative space. You know, I have a big interest in the creatives anyway, and one of the ideas that came from the team back in 2021 was to hold what we call a Women in Creatives event, to create a space for women involved in the creatives here in Kenya to come together and talk about the challenges for women in the creatives. And so we had about 80 individuals representing a whole range of different sectors of the creative space, from radio to TV to the stage, theatre to fashion, music. And it was an incredibly successful event because all those who participated commented that they hadn't been part of what they thought or considered to be a real safe space to be able to freely air their experiences and the challenges they'd faced and continue to face. But it goes to a lot more than just that side of the creatives. We're big on promoting sport as well, and just last month I was up in Turkana. We were sponsoring the inaugural women's football tournament. So women's football is quite popular in the refugee camp in Kakuma, but outside the Kakuma it's very difficult for women and girls to find clubs and be supported. So we actually supported the very first women's soccer tournament. So a number of teams came together and played in Lodwar, and again to see the excitement on the girls' faces and to hear how much it meant to them. And a lot of these are teenage girls. They've got children. They've already, they've gone through a lot.
Yes, indeed. And speaking of creatives, music. I mean, you should have been a musician. Forget Olympic gold medalist for cross country running, but your passion for music. Tell me about it.
Well, I did at one stage want to be a rock star, but it wasn't any good. I couldn't play an instrument at that time. No, I from a very early age, something about music, I just had this incredible passion. I was talking about passion for Africa, but also this passion for music and wanting to hear more. Because back in those days, and we're talking the late 60s, early 70s, especially in my household, what was on the radio was not it wasn't what we call popular music or anything. My parents more listened to talkback radio. So other than these few records, I didn't hear much. But at school, we always used to talk about what was happening. And my friends tended to have older siblings who knew a bit more about it. So I'd hear about these bands and so forth. And I quickly gravitated towards popular rock music. And as I became older and into my teen years, it was rock music and heavy rock music that became important to me. And so I became absolutely fanatical about it, and have bought, and to my wife's despair continued to buy vinyl, because I remain passionate about old vinyl. And I also decided when I was 28, I was going to try and teach myself to play bass guitar.
Oh, do you?
Late in life. I do, but badly. And so I also now enjoy not just listening to music, but playing music. And in my job here, anyone who follows my Twitter account would know that every few weeks I try and bring attention to a young female artist in East Africa, a musician, and try and show to our East African audience how much talent there is.
Yeah.
So I never tweet about male musicians. I tweet female musicians because there's so much happening here in the music scene. And so always trying to find or expose myself to new sounds that are going on here. And there's a lot of bands and artists here in Nairobi in particular, which I love and follow.
Like which ones?
Well, there's a band called the Funkettes. They're a Nairobi-based rock band. I'm their biggest fan. And so if you want to follow them on Spotify or YouTube, I highly recommend them. They're great.
Okay.
And then there's Rish. She's a really talented singer. I love also the more soulful stuff that Nikita Kering, Chematai Sage do. I think Nikita Kering's X song is one of the most brilliant songs I've heard in a long time. There's also some acoustic folky style artists like Nyoki Karul. She's brilliant. There's an artist up in Nyeri called Nelik. I strongly recommend him. He's a more heavy rock artist. There's bands like Parking Lot Grass, Last Year's Tragedy, Murphy's Floor. These are all great bands. In fact, Murphy's Floor brought out a song a long time ago, Kunafanzi, and I thought that's one of the most original rock songs I've ever heard. They were incorporating African influences, much like what Johnny Clegg was doing in South Africa many years ago.
I see how shocked I am. Is my shock registering physically? Because wow, okay, rock, heavy metal.
Yeah, my favourite form of music remains heavy metal. It has for a long time, but I'm very eclectic. I don't just listen to heavy metal. I listen to lots and lots of different things. But if you were to say what's my favourite,
right,
it's
heavy
metal. Yes, I'm an old man now.
No.
That's why I'm not sort of afraid of retirement.
Yeah.
It's a time where I'll be able to pursue those other interests that mean a lot to me.
To you, including reading.
Yes.
What are you reading now?
Right now, I'm reading a book, the first book by Charles Dickens called The Sketches of Boz. And another one I'm reading is called Perspectives on African Literature.
Still Africa.
It's still Africa, yes.
So, so this being your last posting, so we're talking how many years in diplomatic service? 30?
So at the end of this year will have been 34 years.
34.
Yes.
What would you describe those 34 years to be, and what do they mean for you?
So life has turned out very differently from how one envisaged it.
Yeah.
As a sort of late teenager, early 20-something. And life has actually turned out much better than I'd ever envisaged it. And one has to pinch oneself at times to appreciate the sort of unique experiences that one has had. and it's important because it's just not about you. It's about also those you've met and the relationships and getting married and children. So those experiences are shared. But it's important because you've been able to be exposed to a broad palette of colours in that worldly experience that is unique, and none of it would one change. It's not been easy.
Yeah.
There's been lots of challenges,
Yeah.
but you've got to go through those difficulties to realise then the good parts and the benefits. And it was sort of meeting people like Nelson Mandela, who, you know, living in Australia, you would never have envisaged that. But that's something we're able to do, albeit briefly, but still able to do it.
Yeah.
And to see so many countries, as we've seen, has for me, it's made us much better people and more rounded, I think, as individuals. So I'm just forever grateful for the opportunities, because none of it was ever planned. That's the thing. It's turned out in very different way from where one saw oneself as a 25-year-old. Very different.
Yeah. So you went with the flow, basically.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think that's important as a lesson, is not trying to be predetermining things. And if there's one thing about life I've learned, is that there are always these opportunities passing you by. It's how you recognise them as opportunities and what you then do with them. And you've got to be prepared as well to go off into the unknown and just see where that leads, because each part of these different journeys you take opens up new opportunities. And I think that for me has been my biggest lesson. And when younger diplomats ask me, well, what would you tell people is a key lesson?
Would you tell them?
For them? A key lesson is always being open to new opportunities. And I've never thought beyond the next few years, ever. For me, it's always been about seizing opportunities and taking risks. I think it's important that you take risks. That's my key observation.
Wow. So for us who are chronic overthinkers, we should just let that go and flow.
Absolutely. I've never, ever overthought where life might end up.
No.
And that, but that as a character, that's not how I was when I was very young.
Okay.
I was quite conservative and unwilling to take risks.
Yeah.
But once became an adult and beyond, I think, the age of 25, being prepared to take those risks and put oneself into a situation which challenges you. And I think too, that's something I've realised is I've learned not to be afraid of forcing yourself into difficult deadlines or difficult tasks that are going to challenge you, because I think that brings out the best in you, and means you've got to push yourself.
Yeah, yeah. And I like what you said, that it's not been smooth sailing all along. There's been challenges here and there, but you found a way out, or you found a way to overcome that. I'm so honored that you made the time for us tonight to just listen to your story. And you lit up when you started talking about music, and also when you're talking about the love of your life. So for the first time in this program, we are going to be having a second episode next week. This time with the High Commissioner's wife, Miss Helen Williams. And a lot of people perhaps wonder, what does a diplomat's wife do? And we will get to know what she does. She does some amazing, amazing, amazing work with some women organization here in Kenya, as well as, you know, years back, maybe even before she met His Excellency. And also, you know, if you've watched this show long enough, you'll know that, you know, Love and Catherine it's you know, same WhatsApp group. But we will also be getting to hear about your relationship, married 29 years, 2 children. You started dating after meeting her for 3 months. I mean, you were fast. So, which is really cool. I think people should do that once you decide this is the one, this is the one. But I will not preempt your story. So next week, His Excellency is back with his wife. That is a conversation you do not want to miss. And for tonight, I am grateful that, you know, we got to learn a little bit about you, and all the best, you know, when you retire. I don't think you're retiring though. I really don't want to call it retirement. That's not what it is. I just kind of feel like you are ascending into a different version of you. That's just me, but I'm grateful you made the time.
Thank you. It was a real honor and pleasure, Catherine.
Thank you, sir. And wait, should they want to reach the embassy, are you on social media?
We are,
okay.
Yes.
What are your handles?
In terms of
their
Twitter
account names,
and
yes.
Facebook and Instagram, and I'll be corrected if I've got it wrong, but it's AUSHC Kenya.
Okay.
Or at AUSHC Kenya.
Okay.
And I'm just looking. Yes, that's right. So that's across those 3 platforms.
Okay. Twitter,
Facebook, and Instagram.
At AUSHC Kenya. That's Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. So if you have anything you want to say, and I see you actually post lots of like education opportunities, grants. I saw that today.
Yes.
You know, grant opportunities for those who seeking for grants. Yes.
Correct.
So yeah, so that's a page you need to follow on all our platforms. And for me, who Australia is in my bucket list, I will be sending you pictures once I go there. Okay. Thanks for tuning in tonight. Ciao.